We like to say Americans, we're all created equal, but some of us are more equal than others. And it's time to make sure that all of those Americans in Puerto Rico have the same representation.
A bipartisan push in the U.S. Congress to grant Puerto Rico statehood meets resistance from members of the Democratic Party who disagree over the status of the U.S. territory. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory in the Caribbean, has been fighting for autonomy and full citizenship rights for more than a century. Earlier this month, the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. It would grant the island's 3 million U.S. citizens the right to full representation in the U.S. Congress, 2 senators, and as many as 4 or 5 seats in the House of Representatives. Statehood would also allow eligible Puerto Ricans living in the island the right to vote in U.S. elections. It would also give Puerto Ricans greater access to federal funding. The bill has the support of at least 49 House members, 13 Republicans, and 36 Democrats. Polls have consistently shown that a majority of Americans support admitting Puerto Rico as a state. 66% are in favor of statehood. That's 2 in 3 Americans. In a non-binding referendum held in Puerto Rico last November, almost 53% of Puerto Rican participants voted in favor of statehood, and almost 48% were against. Meanwhile, 2 Democratic representatives from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Nydia Velázquez, both of Puerto Rican descent, introduced their own legislation, the Puerto Rican Self-Determination Act, which would allow Puerto Ricans to, quote, exercise their natural right to self-determination by electing a group of delegates to study the issue and come up with a plan for the island's status, including statehood, free association, or even independence. For more on this, I'm joined by Luis Fortuño, Governor of Puerto Rico from 2009 to 2013. As Resident Commissioner for Puerto Rico, he served in the U.S. Congress as a non-voting member of the House of Representatives from 2005 to 2009. Governor Fortuño, the issue of statehood is still hotly contested on the island. In fact, the last referendum did not result in a resounding yes for statehood, although you've said that Puerto Rico cannot continue living in this state of limbo. What makes you so confident that the island is better off being a U.S. state?
Well, we have 50 examples of that, and the most recent ones, Hawaii and Alaska, experienced an economic boom after they became states. Puerto Rico is shortchanged in so many programs, and for investors, they look at Puerto Rico, then they say, well, but it's not as safe as a U.S. State. So this will help tremendously, in addition to all the social programs in which Puerto Rico will also participate.
But there are also economic downsides, aren't there? Because Puerto Ricans, if Puerto Rico did become a state, would also have to pay a federal income tax in addition to local state taxes.
That is true. However, since Puerto Rico does not fully participate in all these federal programs, but must comply with the federal programs, the state government has to actually put all this money. So state taxes are pretty high in Puerto Rico. And at the end of the day, it hasn't worked as it was supposed to work. Perhaps as a transition in the 50s and 60s, this status worked, but it no longer works. And actually, a vast majority of people feel the same way. In 2012, a vast majority of people, and actually that question was never questioned by anyone, a vast majority of people rejected the current territorial status. We need to finish this discussion once and for all.
But hold on, you say a vast majority of people. But when you have 52.5% of Puerto Ricans saying they're in favor of statehood, and by the way, when they weren't even given other choices, the referendum did not ask Puerto Ricans which option they preferred. It only asked, should Puerto Rico be immediately admitted into the Union, yes or no? When you say it's a big majority, it really isn't. You have almost 48% of Puerto Ricans who are against statehood. So why not give the people of Puerto Rico the choice to decide for themselves if they want statehood, independence, or something else?
We have had those choices before, and in the past, the current territorial status prevailed. And then starting in the last 20 years, statehood has prevailed by a slim margin, but it has prevailed. However, I tell you one thing. If the US Congress were to legislate so that it would say that this is it, if you want to become a state, you have to say it now, I guarantee you that that number will go up dramatically. For example, in the last vote that we had, a lot of people voted against it because they were mad at the previous governor. It has nothing to do with status. Congress has a responsibility to ask U.S. citizens residing in Puerto Rico, what do they prefer?
But why should it be up to Congress? Why shouldn't it be up to the Puerto Ricans themselves? Two progressive Democratic congresswomen, Ocasio-Cortez and Velázquez, who opposed the push for statehood, wrote this last year. They say, for true legitimate change, Puerto Rico's status must be resolved from the ground up. Plans for altering the island's relationship with the U.S. should not just garner the consent of the Puerto Rican people, they should originate with them. In fact, many in Puerto Rico would view Congress pushing statehood not as an end to colonization, but the culmination of it. Now, these are strong words by U.S. Congresswomen of Puerto Rican descent. They say that imposing statehood by making it the only option would in fact be as coercive as the island's current status. Should political leaders in Washington determine what is the right path for Puerto Rico?
Well, certainly two members of Congress from New York should not. Our Congresswoman favors statehood, and she won by over 10 points. Our current governor favors statehood, and he also won. The bottom line here is that we need, it's like a marriage. The two have to agree. So we can say in Puerto Rico that we want, for example, as the people that support territorial status have been saying for years, oh, we want to stay as we are. We don't want to pay taxes, but we want full parity in federal programs. We want to be able to determine which treaties we enter in, we accept and which we don't accept, and so on and so forth. If that were an option, there'll be 50 states asking for that option. That is not realistic. So that's why we need Congress to also engage in this process.
But is it realistic to expect that 60 senators in the US Senate will actually okay this push for statehood? Because Republicans, as you know, and I know when you were the non-voting member from Puerto Rico in the US Congress, you worked and caucused with Republicans. As you know, many Republicans are saying that statehood for Puerto Rico would in fact give the island 2 more Democratic senators, 4 or 5 House members, more and votes in the Electoral College. So are you convinced that members of the US Congress will in fact allow Puerto Rico to become a state?
Well, and I know that some Republicans have said that. However, historically, many Republicans have also supported statehood if the people of Puerto Rico support it. And actually, we have current U.S. senators like Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott that have said that if the Puerto Ricans actually vote in a process that is mandated by Congress for statehood, they would be for statehood. That secondly, the fact that the current representative in Congress is a Republican and has been re-elected, she's in her 5th year. The fact that I got elected to that seat and later on to become governor shows you that it is not realistic to believe that all will be Democrats, all will be Republicans. I think Puerto Rico will be a purple state, and it will be up to the national parties to actually gain the favor of the voters if they want that.
All right. Former Governor of Puerto Rico, Luis Fortuño, great to see you again. Thanks very much for being on the program.
Likewise. Thank you.
Now, while former Governor Fortuño strongly endorses statehood, not all former governors of Puerto Rico share his views. Former Governor Sila Calderón wrote a letter to President Biden making the case against Puerto Rico becoming a U.S. state. She joins me now. Governor Calderón, you disagree with former Governor Fortuño that Puerto Rico's only and best option is statehood. Why?
I definitely disagree, although I respect Governor Fortuño a lot. The reason I disagree is because Puerto Rico, even though we have a good relationship and a legal relationship with the United States, we are a different people. We are Hispanics. We have a different culture, different values. We do have our American citizenship, which we cherish, and the relationship with the states, but we want to be ourselves. We're not Americans. We're American citizens, but we are Puerto Ricans from Spanish ancestry.
Does this mean that you want to be independent? Is that the best option for Puerto Rico?
Not necessarily. We have a Commonwealth relationship with the United States based on a congressional law number 600, which allows us to have our own government, but still we're under the congressional powers. So we would like our relationship of Commonwealth to evolve into a relationship that allows us not to be under the plenary powers of Congress, but to have our own government. We do have our own government, but our own independence or interdependence with the United States, rather.
But there was a referendum, as you know, in November, a non-binding referendum that you have questioned because you believe that 52% of people voting for statehood isn't enough. In your letter to the President and Vice President of the US, you and two other former governors wrote this. You say, statehooders have sought the support from liberals by framing statehood as a civil rights issue. By denying it to Puerto Ricans, their argument goes the US is denying them equality. But given the ebbs and flows of public opinion, the minimal majority of 52% obtained by statehood option allows for only one indisputable conclusion, that the people of Puerto Rico are divided on this issue. But if this had been a binding referendum, then 52% would have been enough for statehood, wouldn't it?
Well, first of all, it was not a binding. It's a hypothetical question, so I could not answer that. But the reason why there was a majority, because there were no other options. And people do cherish our relationship, our permanent relationship with the United States. I'm sure there would have been other options. They would have not had a majority. So the two questions, yes or no, leads to a lot of misunderstanding from the part of the voters.
But aren't there benefits, though, to statehood? In your letter, you mentioned the economic consequences statehood could present for Puerto Ricans if the residents of the island have to pay both federal and local state taxes. But wouldn't statehood also help Puerto Rico with its public debt? Over $70 billion. Wouldn't statehood help Puerto Rico renegotiate its debt with the federal government?
Well, we're already renegotiating with the help of a board appointed by the President of the United States. So that's going to be renegotiated by next year. But you know, everything in life is not money. There are other values that are very important. And we want to be a self-sustained entity. We don't pay federal taxes. We don't vote in the elections. And we're happy as we are. So I think definitely statehood will never win a majority if the real options are offered to the people of Puerto Rico.
You say we're happy as we are, but is the status quo, though, tenable?
It's not a status quo. It is a status. We want to develop it. But if we were a state, that would be a status quo too. So we want a developed Commonwealth, and we believe we will achieve it eventually. It's going to take a long time, but we will achieve it, definitely.
The current resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, the one person who actually represents the island in the US Congress, a Republican who supported Trump, has referred to the island as a US colony and said that becoming a state wouldn't solve all of its issues. She says right now Congress decides the regulations of the air we breathe, the water we drink, and we do not have participation. She says she's the only member representing the island and there are no senators. How is the most democratic country in the whole world going to fight for democracy in all corners? And then in your backyard, you still have a territory, you still have a colony. Do you agree with those words? Do you agree with those who call Puerto Rico a colony of the United States?
I do not agree with them because obviously she's very biased because she's a stateholder. But I do agree in the sense, the only aspect I agree is that we have to develop the status we have now. So we're not under the plenary powers of Congress. And I'm sure we'll be able to develop an arrangement, legal arrangement with the United States by which we can remain Puerto Ricans and still be associated with the United States. And some of the negative aspects that Commonwealth has now can be spoken, can be discussed, and can be solved.
Former Governor Ghida Calderon, so good to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.
Now, the question of Puerto Rico's status has lingered for decades. Since 1967, 6 non-binding referendums have taken place. Past votes included options for statehood, independence, and status quo. In 2017, only 1.5% voted for independence and more than 97% voted for statehood, but that referendum had a 23% turnout. Calls for statehood grew after the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in 2017, with more than 3,000 deaths and nearly $100 billion in damages, which exposed the unequal treatment Puerto Ricans receive under their current territorial status. And while it faces over $70 billion in debt, the island cannot file for bankruptcy like cities and counties in the United States because of its status as, quote, an unincorporated U.S. territory. This despite Puerto Rico paying payroll tax, which helps fund federal programs such as Medicaid, among others. So then, will new calls to resolve Puerto Rico's status help address some of those long-standing structural problems and inequalities? I'm joined by George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, a longtime advocate of Puerto Rico statehood, and Jose Lopez, Executive Director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center and Lecturer of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's a longtime supporter of Puerto Rican independence. George Laws Garcia, let me start with you. Puerto Ricans, as you know, are divided on this issue. Not everyone in Puerto Rico wants U.S. statehood. Some believe the island is a nation in itself with its own history, its own culture, its own language, its own way of life. The referendum did not give Puerto Ricans a choice between 2 or more status options, just statehood. There was no consensus, far from it. If Puerto Ricans did have that choice, if you had the choice, would you still favor statehood over independence or any other form of self-determination?
Well, Ghida, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you and your audience. The reality is that saying that there's no consensus basically ignores the fact that in a democracy, the majority of the citizens that vote are the ones that ultimately decide. And while we definitely acknowledge that Puerto Rico has a unique culture and identity, and that's something that is clearly established in a number of different ways, both by Puerto Ricans who reside on the island, as well as Puerto Ricans like Mr. Lopez, who reside stateside and represent that culture very proudly. That does not necessarily mean that culture and identity can only be exercised through the form of having a sovereign, independent country. You can continue to be fully Puerto Rican and be fully American as a state.
Well, let me put that point to Jose Lopez. Can you be both at once? And did Puerto Rico decide which status it wants? Are decisions made by those who ultimately show up and vote?
I would say that the first and most important thing is to be able to have a process of self-determination that actually the Congress of the United States commits itself to. Puerto Rico legally is a piece of property of the Congress of the United States. It was declared so in 1922 in the legal case that established that Puerto Rico belongs to, but it's not a part of the United States. Being a possession of someone and being treated as an object does not really allow me to fully actualize myself. Puerto Ricans are a people that was, as a nation, were historically formed and informed. Puerto Ricans, in the process of becoming citizens of the United States in 1917, had 2 rights: the right to die for the United States and the right to leave Puerto Rico. Today, almost 60% of the Puerto Rican nation resides in the United States, and we are among the poorest of the poorest, meaning that we have lived statehood, and we surely don't want it.
Certainly 6 million Puerto Ricans living in the United States, presumably a good chunk of those people are not for statehood. They may favor independence. What do you say to the argument for independence, that Puerto Rico is better off not being subservient to the United States, not being a part of the U.S.?
So, the reality is that although I fully respect what Mr. Lopez is saying, the reality is that Puerto Ricans have continued to leave Puerto Rico under its current territory status, and they've moved stateside. They haven't gone to other countries. They've decided to move to the States. And the reality is that if we actually look at the level of economic progress that Puerto Ricans have made stateside, it's significantly more than the progress of those that remain on the island. I think that both Mr. Lopez and I are in agreement that under the current territory status, Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States and a possession, and that needs to end. And that's one thing that I think that independence supporters and statehood supporters have in common, that our common enemy is the injustice of colonialism. We just have different visions for how Puerto Rico can develop to its full potential. And I believe that that is with full equality and full rights under the U.S. citizenship that we have right now.
Jose Lopez, is that the best way for Puerto Rico to develop to its full potential? Can the island manage on its own? It's heavily indebted. Wouldn't it benefit greatly by receiving federal funding from the U.S. government if it were to become a state?
For the past 123 years, the U.S. has ruled Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is in a miserable state, literally ruled by an oversight imperial board that is not elected, it's not democratic, makes all the decisions about our fiscal situation, has forced literally millions of Puerto Rico to leave Puerto Rico. Millions of Puerto Ricans were forced to leave Puerto Rico between 1946 and 1966, the greatest airborne migration in modern history. We have been literally held in a bondage situation. Colonialism literally means that you are trying to destroy and do away with a group of people. Statehood for Hawaii has meant almost the destruction of the Hawaiian nationality. There is no state that has entered the Union in which the original people were the majority of the people that became part of the Union. The U.S. is a country that's informed by white supremacy. White supremacy is a system that's literally upholds modern colonialism, and Puerto Rico has been a product of colonialism since its beginning.
I think that the issue of Puerto Rico's the colonial nature of Puerto Rico's current territory status is something on which the statehood supporters agree with those that support independence. We both think that it's fundamentally wrong, and we both have a very clear understanding that it is rooted in a fundamentally racist thought that is encapsulated most clearly in the insular cases. So we're in agreement on that front. I think what is also clear is that there was a massive outmigration from Puerto Rico in the 1940s and 50s, due mostly to massive, economic issues on the island. And a large portion of the population that migrated at the time was also facing political persecution for views in support of independence, which is part of why you have so many legacy communities of stateside Puerto Ricans that support this in New York and Chicago and other places. However, on the island, the actual voters that reside there, that vote there, those people have in the past 8 years voted 3 times against continuing the territory status. And when the non-territorial status options have been presented to them, the majority has favored statehood over independence or any other non-territory status.
To speak that there's an overwhelming support for statehood in Puerto Rico is not true.
All right, a fascinating discussion. Jose Lopez and George Laws Garcia, thank you both very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Since the 1898 Treaty of Paris, by which Spain ceded the territory to the United States, the fate and status of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico is, on and off, subject to debates. And when the debates reach the US Congress, the stakes become higher. Today, at a time of hyper-partisanship between Republicans and Democrats, the status of Puerto Rico is more likely than ever to be seen through the prism of party politics rather than American national interest, especially since the Vieques U.S. Navy base in Puerto Rico was permanently closed in 2003 after years of protests. And if party politics are at play, comparing Puerto Rico to a former US dominion gives us a clue of things to come. Since being annexed by the US in 1898, the year of the Treaty of Paris, Hawaii, which was until then on the UN list of non-self-governing territories, became a full-fledged US state in 1959. And since, it elected only one Republican senator. The same trends are very likely if Puerto Rico was to become a US state. And so, in short, the issue of statehood, not only for Puerto Rico, but also for Washington, D.C., and possibly other US territories such as Guam or the US Virgin Islands, is a critical one for their respective populations. But it is likely to be an existential one for the Republican Party. Winning those prospective new states may well be a contest already lost. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, for this week. Next week, we'll be taking a look at whether Washington, D.C. should become a state. For now, though, from all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.